Your state passes a salary transparency law. Companies are now required to post salary ranges on job listings. Full transparency. You can finally see what the job actually pays before you waste 3 rounds of interviews finding out the number doesn't work. You feel good about this. This is progress. This is the information asymmetry closing. This is workers finally getting the data they deserve. So you open LinkedIn, you start browsing. You find a role that matches yours almost exactly. Same title, same industry, same required experience. The posted range, $60,000 to $140,000 $80,000 range. For the same job. You're currently making $72,000. You look at that range and think, I'm in the lower half, but I'm not at the bottom. That seems okay. That seems like where someone with my experience should be. You feel, if anything, slightly relieved. And that feeling, that specific, quiet relief, is exactly what someone was hoping you'd feel. Because that range was not designed to inform you. It was designed to manage you, to anchor your expectations, to make $72,000 feel like a reasonable, defensible, appropriate number for someone like you, without ever having an honest conversation about what you're actually worth. Salary transparency laws were passed to give workers power, and in the hands of certain employers, they are being systematically used to do the opposite. Today, we're going to break down exactly how this works, the specific mechanisms, the psychology behind them, and what you actually need to know to use salary transparency data in your favor rather than against yourself. The information asymmetry that transparency was supposed to fix. To understand how transparency is being weaponized, you first need to understand what it was supposed to solve. For most of the history of employment, salary information was almost entirely opaque to workers and almost entirely visible to employers. Companies knew what they paid every employee. They had market salary surveys. They had compensation consultants. They had decades of data on what candidates would accept, at what point offers got rejected, what ranges worked in different markets. Workers had almost none of this. They knew what they made, maybe what a few friends made, if those conversations happened, and a general sense from aggregated self-reported data on sites like Glassdoor, which is useful but imprecise. This asymmetry had a predictable outcome. Workers consistently undersold themselves. They accepted offers without knowing how much room existed. They didn't negotiate because they didn't know what was negotiable. They stayed in roles for years without realizing the market had moved significantly above their current salary. Salary transparency laws were designed to fix this. If companies have to post what they're actually willing to pay, workers can make informed decisions. The information gap closes. The power balance shifts. In theory. In practice, companies that were built on information asymmetry don't simply accept its elimination. They adapt. They find ways to use the new rules to their advantage. And several of those adaptations are working remarkably well. Mechanism 1. The deliberately wide range. The first and most common mechanism is the range that is so wide it communicates almost nothing. $60,000 to $140,000, $50,000 to $120,000, $80,000 to $160,000. These ranges appear to provide information. They technically comply with the law, and they tell you almost nothing useful. Here's why they exist. A genuinely informative salary range for a specific role with specific requirements would be relatively narrow. If the company knows what they're willing to pay, and they do, the honest range might be $90,000 to $105,000 for a mid-level marketing manager with 5 years of experience. But that honest range creates problems for the company. It tells candidates exactly where the ceiling is before negotiations begin, reducing leverage in offers. It exposes internal pay equity issues when current employees compare their salaries to the posted range. It constrains flexibility in making offers to different candidates differently based on factors that may not survive scrutiny. So instead of posting the real range, Companies post a range wide enough to include almost any candidate they might consider. From an entry-level person they'd lowball to a senior person they'd stretch the budget for. The range is technically accurate. In theory, they might pay someone $60,000 or someone $140,000 for this role. But for the specific person reading the posting, with their specific experience in the current hiring environment, for this specific position, the actual range is much narrower, and you don't know where in that wide band you fall. So the number provides the feeling of information without the substance of it. Worse, if your current salary falls anywhere in that wide range, you're psychologically anchored to it. You feel accounted for. You feel like the number you're making is somewhere in the legitimate territory. The pressure to push significantly higher dissipates. That's the function of the wide range. Not to inform you, to contain your expectations while appearing transparent. Mechanism 2. The anchoring effect. Anchoring is one of the most well-documented phenomena in behavioral economics. When people are exposed to a number before making a judgment or decision, that number disproportionately influences their assessment, even when they consciously know it's arbitrary or misleading. Salary ranges are anchoring machines. When you see a posted range of $60,000 to $120,000, the bottom of that range, $60,000, becomes a reference point in your mind, even if you'd never accept $60,000. Even if $60,000 is clearly below your market value, the number has been introduced into your cognitive frame. And the midpoint, $90,000 in this example, becomes a kind of psychological center of gravity. It feels like the normal outcome, the reasonable expectation, the place a non-greedy, appropriately calibrated person would land. If you were going to ask for $110,000 before you saw the range, seeing the range may pull that number down, not dramatically, not consciously, but the anchor does its work. This is not speculation. It's the result of decades of research on anchoring across negotiation contexts. And salary negotiation is one of the highest stakes negotiation contexts most people ever encounter. Companies that post salary ranges are not doing so naively. The ranges they post, the specific numbers chosen, the width of the band, are decisions made by compensation teams and HR professionals who understand exactly how anchoring works. The range is a negotiation tool presented as a transparency measure. The floor of the range pulls down aggressive asks. The midpoint creates a sense of fairness around numbers that may be below market. And the ceiling, technically there but rarely reached, creates the feeling that upside exists, even when organizational practice ensures very few people actually get there. Mechanism 3. The internal equity trap. Here's a mechanism that operates almost invisibly. When salary transparency laws pass, a common company response is to conduct an internal pay equity audit, reviewing whether current employees are being paid consistently and within posted ranges. This sounds like a good thing, and it can be. But there's a specific way it gets deployed that works against employees. If your current salary is below the posted range for your role, the company faces a choice. They can raise your salary to bring you into the range, or they can repost the range lower. Increasingly, companies do neither of these things cleanly. Instead, they bring below-range employees up to the floor of the range and present this as a raise, often a meaningful one, without ever addressing whether the range itself is competitive with the external market. You get a 7% raise. You're told it's about internal equity and transparency. The company has made progress on pay equity, but the range they've brought you into might still be 10 or 15% below what equivalent roles pay at other companies. The raise was real, the framing was misleading. And because you're now in range, you feel less urgency to evaluate whether that range itself reflects your market value. The transparency law created a mechanism for companies to give employees a raise that feels significant while potentially preserving or even widening The gap between what those employees earn and what they could earn elsewhere. Mechanism 4. The performance band system. Many companies use what are called pay bands or performance zones within salary ranges. The posted range is $60,000 to $120,000. But internally, the company has further subdivided this range. New hires typically land between 60 and 75. Employees meeting expectations sit between 75 and 90. High performers reach 90 to 105. Exceptional performers rarely go above that. And annual merit increases are structured to move people through these bands slowly. 3 to 4% for meeting expectations, 5 to 6% for exceeding, maybe 8% in exceptional years. At these rates, an employee who starts at $65,000 and receives strong performance reviews for 5 years might reach $85,000 or $90,000, which sounds like progress, and it is relative to where they started. But what happened in the external market during those 5 years? If the market for this role moved from $65,000 to $100,000, the employee went from being paid at market to being paid 15% below market. Despite 5 years of strong performance and consistent increases, the performance band system keeps employees moving upward within a range that may itself be falling behind the external market. And because the increases feel real and positive, the drift below market is invisible until the employee applies for a job elsewhere and discovers what the market is actually willing to pay. Salary transparency shows you the range. It doesn't show you how the range compares to external market data. It doesn't show you what movement through the range actually looks like over time. It doesn't show you the performance band structure that governs where you'll actually land. You see one number. The system has many more that you don't. Mechanism 5. The gratitude engineering. Let's talk about the psychological mechanism that ties all of this together. When salary information was completely opaque, workers operated in uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it also preserves possibilities. If you don't know what others are making, you can imagine that the gap might be significant. You can justify the discomfort of negotiating aggressively, of pushing for more, of exploring the market. Salary transparency, deployed strategically, eliminates that productive uncertainty and replaces it with the feeling of having answered the question. You see the range. You see where you fall in it. And unless you're below the floor, which would be embarrassing for the company and visible, you feel accounted for, included, positioned within the legitimate territory. This feeling is extraordinarily valuable to employers because the primary financial risk they face from any employee is not poor performance. It's the employee deciding they're undervalued and leaving. Turnover is expensive. Replacing an experienced employee typically costs between 50% and 200% of that employee's annual salary when you account for recruiting, training, productivity loss, and institutional knowledge. The most cost-effective way to prevent turnover is not to pay people what they're worth. It's to make people feel like they're being paid what they're worth. Visible salary ranges, anchored carefully, structured intelligently, communicated with the language of equity and transparency, are extraordinarily effective at producing that feeling. You feel seen. You feel considered. You feel like the company is being honest with you in a way that, by implication, suggests the number is fair. The gratitude this produces is real, and it is engineered. What the law doesn't require. Here's the most important thing to understand about salary transparency laws: what they don't cover. Most laws require companies to post salary ranges. They don't require those ranges to be narrow or realistic. They don't require companies to disclose where current employees actually fall within the range. They don't require disclosure of what percentage of employees actually reach the top of the range. They don't require the methodology used to determine the range. They don't require comparison to external market benchmarks. They require a range. That's often it. The result is that companies post ranges that comply with the letter of the law while obscuring everything. That would make the information genuinely useful. What would genuinely useful salary transparency look like? It would show the actual distribution of current employees' salaries in the role, not just the range. It would show what new hires with specific experience profiles are actually receiving. It would show how the range compares to industry benchmarks from credible sources. It would show the typical trajectory through the range for strong performers. None of this is required. Almost none of it is voluntarily disclosed. What you have is the appearance of transparency, the vocabulary of equity, and a number that has been carefully chosen to manage your expectations rather than inform them. How to actually use salary transparency data. So what do you do with this? First, treat posted ranges as a floor signal, not a midpoint signal. If a company posts 60 to 120,000, the useful information is not the range. It's that the company has indicated willingness to pay up to 120,000 for this role. That ceiling is the relevant number, not because you should expect it, but because it establishes that the budget exists. Your negotiation should start well above the midpoint. Second, triangulate against external data before every significant salary conversation. Posted ranges tell you what one company says they might pay. External market data from multiple sources, filtered by location, industry, company size, and experience level, tells you what the market actually pays. These are different numbers. The external data should anchor you, not the posted range. Third, ask the questions the range doesn't answer. What's the typical starting salary for candidates with my specific experience level? What does progression through this range look like for strong performers? Where do current employees in this role typically sit in the range? These questions are not inappropriate. They are the follow-up questions that turn a managed disclosure into actual information. Some companies will answer. Some will deflect. Both responses are informative. Fourth, recalibrate your market value regularly and independently of your current employer's assessment. Your employer's view of your value is not objective. It's filtered through budget constraints, internal equity considerations, and the organizational incentive to pay you as little as necessary to retain you. External offers, recruiter conversations, and industry salary data give you an unfiltered view. The gap between what your employer thinks you're worth and what the market would pay you is something you should know. And the only way to know it is to look for it actively, not wait for it to surface in a posted range. Closing. The salary range is posted. You can see the number. You feel informed. You feel like the system is working for you now. Like the company is being honest. Like you have the information you need to make good decisions. That feeling, that specific, quiet reassurance, may be the most expensive thing in the posting. Because if it keeps you from negotiating aggressively, from researching the external market, from having the difficult conversation about what you're actually worth, then the transparency accomplished the opposite of its purpose. It made you grateful for less. The law changed. The information is visible now. But the system it revealed is more sophisticated than a simple number suggests. And operating within that system effectively requires something the law can't give you. It requires knowing that the range is a tool, that the anchor is intentional, that the feeling of fairness is engineered, and then deciding to find out through external data, through direct questions, through the uncomfortable process of actually testing your market value, what the number behind the number actually is. Because the posted range tells you what the company wants you to think they might pay, your market value tells you what someone would actually pay to have you. Those are different numbers. And the gap between them is what's at stake every time you accept a posted range as the answer to the question of what you're worth.